Well, welcome to the More to the Story podcast. I'm so glad you all have come along. And if you have just clicked on this link because you saw the title, I hope you'll stick in and you'll enjoy this conversation, which I think gives us a sense of where and how God has created us to think about things even outside of our physical bodies. And so I'm real excited to introduce our guest to you in just a second. But this podcast comes to you from Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are sending out trusted leaders for faithful churches. And we do that through bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees. We also have a host of certificate programs, lay initiatives, just Bible studies and courses that are available for folks. So while we kind of mainly emphasize the work God's called us to do in training pastors, we also see it as a key task in training leaders to serve the church. And so we've done that, for instance, through a connection with the Global Methodist Church. We have more than 490 Global Methodist Church pastors studying with us right now as they're preparing for ordination in that denomination, and then a host of other denominations and groups that wouldn't even affiliate with the denomination that are connected to us. So we'd love for you to check us out at Wesley Biblical Seminary. And that's wbs.edu is our website. And I'd love for folks to sign up for my email list at andymillerthird.com. That's andymilleriii.com. And if you do, I'll send you a free tool called 5 Steps to Deeper Teaching and Preaching. And then you'll get on my email list and I'll update you with regular content that comes out from More to the Story Ministries and the More to Story podcast. I have some Bible studies, if you're interested in what we're talking about today, I have a study called Heaven, Hell, and Everything in Between. And I think, and there's a little section there, which I think probably will need to be updated after this podcast on near-death experiences. I understand it more fully as a result of the book we're going to discuss today. So there's also a study of the book of Jude, on a study of the doctrine of holiness that you can find at my website, andymillerthird.com. And those are things that can be used in churches and small groups and the like. So just love for you to check that out at my website. All right. I want to welcome into the podcast Dr. Michael Egnor, who serves as a professor of neurosurgery at Stony Brook University and has performed more than 7,000 brain surgeries. This is, I don't know if I've had a brain surgeon on before, much less a professor of brain surgery. Dr. Egnor, thank you for coming to the podcast.
Thank you, Andy. It's a privilege to be here.
And I'm holding up your book now for those who are on YouTube, who are watching on YouTube, The Immortal Mind. And this is a fascinating study. And as I indicated in my introduction, I've thought a little bit more deeply about some of these topics in light of a book that I have coming out on heaven, hell, and everything in between. But beyond that, I'm just fascinated by your own story, which kicks off this book, which maybe helps us understand how you get into this. Because even though you got to a place of becoming a neurosurgeon, you had this dramatic encounter, and you were an atheist. So help us understand your story, and that will then maybe lead us into thinking about your work in this book.
Sure. I was raised in a secular family. I think my parents believed in God, although I wasn't baptized. My father never went to church. My mother would go on Christmas, maybe. And I grew up loving science. I was fascinated with science. I thought that was the most wonderful thing in the world, was to understand the universe and the human body and how nature worked. And that was kind of my religion when I was a young person. And I was never an angry atheist, meaning I actually always thought Christianity was a really nice idea, and I thought Christians were pretty nice people. And I kind of wished I were a Christian, except
Yeah.
I thought it was a fairy tale. I thought it was, I can't commit my life to a fairy tale, especially when there's something as beautiful as science out there, So I majored in biochemistry in college, and I went to medical school, and I fell in love with neuroscience and the anatomy of the brain. And I decided I wanted to be a neurosurgeon. So I trained in neurosurgery at the University of Miami, and graduated in 1991 and became a assistant professor at Stony Brook in Long Island. And, sort of continued my career, and I've been at Stony Brook ever since. And I began seeing things in my practice that didn't quite fit the textbooks. The textbooks of neuroscience, of course, were obviously kind of materialistically based. The human mind came from interactions of neurons in the brain, and if you understood the anatomy well enough, you'd understand the human mind. And some of my patients didn't quite fit that paradigm. There was a young girl who was born with about 2/3 of her brain missing. And I was a little pessimistic with her family about how she would do. I mean, it certainly didn't look like things were going to work out well. And she grew up perfectly normally. She's a young woman in her 20s. If you were to meet her, she's just a bright young woman. Her mother says she's too smart for her own good. And I don't have a good explanation for that. I have another little boy who was born with also about 2/3 of his brain missing. And the initial decision was actually to not even feed him as a newborn because they felt he would be so profoundly handicapped that it might be better if he just passed away. And because of experiences that we had had previously with patients, we kind of vetoed that decision and fed him and so on. He recently graduated from high school, was perfectly normal kid. I have a young lady who is missing major parts of the back of her brain and has fluid in the center of her brain, who I first saw as a patient when she was about 7 years old because she was having some headaches. It turned out just to be stress because she was in a gifted program for children. And she's a published musician. She has a master's degree in English literature. And I have a little boy that I've taken care of who is missing all of his brain above his brain stem. That is, from about here on up, there's just water, nothing.
Wow.
And he's rather handicapped. I mean, he can't speak, he can't sit up, he can't feed himself, but he's fully conscious. He laughs, he cries, he smiles when he sees his family. He's got all sorts of appropriate interactions with the world. But all the theories I'd read in my textbook said there's no way this kid could be in anything except like near brain death or in a coma. And he was not by any means in a coma. What kind of turned me on this intellectually, besides seeing all these patients, and these are only a few of the patients I've seen, these kinds of things, was an experience I had. There's a kind of surgery we call awake brain surgery, and that is when the patient is awake during the operation, which you can do. You can give local anesthesia to the scalp. The brain doesn't have a sense of pain, so it doesn't hurt to operate on the brain. And sometimes we have to map the surface of the brain to determine where the critical areas are so we can avoid damaging them as we're doing the surgery. And that it's best if someone's awake for that because you can map it and determine what their experiences are as we're doing our work. And this was a woman in her 40s who had a brain tumor that was infiltrating much of her left frontal lobe near her speech area. And so I had to map her speech area. So I was talking with her as we were removing this tumor and removing quite a bit of her left frontal lobe because the tumor had infiltrated. And during this process, we had a wonderful conversation, talking about the cafeteria food, about her family, about the weather. Went on for several hours. And after the surgery, I was just amazed. I said, I was removing critical parts of this woman's brain, or at least my textbook said they were critical. They were part of her left frontal lobe, which was supposed to be where her intellect was. And she was completely normal during the whole process and made an excellent recovery, and she did fine. So there's obviously a lot more to the mind and to the soul than just the brain itself. But of course, there are aspects of the mind that are very closely related to the brain. I mean, if you damage a person's optic nerves, they can't see, they go blind. People go paralyzed from having strokes. So clearly there are some things about the brain and that relates directly to the mind, but other things not so clearly related. And I wanted to learn more about that. At about the same time I was seeing these things, I was having some personal experiences. I have 4 kids, and as my children were born, I really got a sense that I was being given a gift. People would say, "Gee, look at these beautiful children you and your wife have made." And I said, "Well, we didn't make them. Right? They were made by somebody else. They came through us, but they didn't come from us." So I was getting these, what I would call hauntings, these notions that even though I didn't believe in God, I got the feeling that I was missing something, that I didn't know why I was here. I didn't know why I was alive. I didn't know where I was going. And none of us really do. Intrinsically, we don't, it's not something we're born knowing. And it seemed to me odd that I wasn't asking those questions on a deeper level. But I kind of avoided them because the life is so busy and you got stuff to do and you don't
Right.
have time thinking about stuff like that. And when when my youngest son was born, we noticed when he was a few months old that he wasn't making eye contact with us and he wasn't smiling, and we were concerned that he might be autistic.
Yeah.
So we took him to a pediatric neurologist who said, well, you can't really tell, he's too young to know for sure. And I was emotionally pretty torn up by this. I mean, people who have severe autism have difficulty forming interpersonal relationships. And I thought that the thought that my son wouldn't know me or love me or be connected to me was a terrifying thought. So one night I was seeing a patient in consultation at an outside hospital. It was a Catholic hospital. And I saw the patient, but this was really weighing on my mind. So as I left the hospital, there was a chapel. And I stopped in the chapel. It was late at night. Chapel was open 24/7. And I knelt in front of the altar and I prayed to God. And I said, look, I don't know if you exist. I have serious doubts, but I'm kind of between a rock and a hard place right now. And I need your help on this. I can't take the thought that my son wouldn't know me or love me. And I heard a voice, and the voice was not my own voice. It was the only time in my life I heard a voice, and the voice said, but that's what you're doing to me.
Wow.
So I kind of collapsed in front of the altar, and I realized that what God was doing was showing me what it feels like to love a child and have the child not know you.
Wow.
And so I said, okay, I won't do it to you anymore, but please heal my son. And a couple of days later, it was my son's 6-month birthday. And at the birthday party, he was completely normal. He was smiling, interacting, totally normal child. And he's currently a law student. So he's doing just fine. So I went to the church. I said, I got to get baptized right now.
Did you? Okay.
A number of my kids got baptized, and I've sort of devoted my life to loving the Lord and acknowledging the Lord, and to helping other people see what it took me so long to see. And I think what I saw in my profession, what I saw in the practice of neurosurgery, mixed nicely with what I saw in my personal life and in my spiritual life, that God exists, that we have souls, and that God wants us to know him and love him.
Yes. Oh, what a beautiful story of bringing these things together. And with that question that came to you, how fascinating, like that you're doing the same thing to me. You've mentioned a few times, and as you're talking about people who have major portions of their brain missing, but yet they were still functioning outside of that. And then you started to identify that as soul. And I affirm, and like at our institution, we affirm that we are people made up of body and soul. Some would add spirit to that, but help me even think about the terms that we use. Sometimes we use mind, soul, spirit. What is this referring to? This other kind of immaterial reality that's a part of us.
It's a great question. It's a profound question, one that has fascinated me for decades. And I should first point out that the human mind is connected to the human brain, obviously, in many very important ways. And the connections that are for sure, and this is just my own personal experience, but also the experience of great neuroscientists, of other neurosurgeons. This is a very well-studied subject. First of all, the brain is vital for homeostasis, which is what keeps us alive. It's vital for controlling our heart rate and our blood pressure and things like that. It's also vital for us being awake and alert and paying attention to things and so on. If your brain isn't working right, there are many situations in which you're in a coma. So the brain clearly mediates that. In addition, there are 4 things that we do or that we experience that our brain is intimately related to. And this has been found by people who've studied seizures. Wilder Penfield was a famous neurosurgeon who did a lot of awake brain surgery and studied this in very great detail. The four things that are for which the brain is absolutely necessary is movement, first of all. That is, that the brain controls the movement of our limbs and so on. And if you have a stroke or a brain injury in a specific part of the brain, you are paralyzed in that part of your body. There's no question about that. Your brain controls perception, your ability to see, to hear, to feel, to taste. All those things are controlled through brain circuits. Your brain controls emotions. That is, it controls to a very significant degree joy, sadness, anxiety, fear. All those things can be localizable to certain regions of the brain. And the brain controls memory. Memory in the sense of retention of images, that if I remember my grandmother's face, I can see her face in my imagination. And all of those things, there's a ton of neuroscience that shows that those things are mediated by the brain. But strangely enough, there are things that don't seem to be mediated by the brain. There are things for which the brain seems to be necessary but not sufficient. And the two broad categories of things are intellect and will. The intellect is our ability for reason, for abstract thought, for thinking about universal concepts, our ability to think about justice, our ability to think about humanity as an abstract thing, or to think about God. All of those things are abstract thoughts. And our will, which is our free will, that is our ability to choose based on moral law. The intellect and will don't seem to come from the brain in the same way that movement comes and perception comes. Obviously, you kind of need a brain that's working okay to express intellect and will. But the connection is much, much weaker, and it seems as if intellect and will have an existence of their own that is immaterial and is independent of the brain and of the body to a significant extent. And if you want to, we can go into the neuroscience.
Yeah. I'm interested. I want to come back to some of the work that you summarized from Penfield, but since you're right there already, thinking about the way that even people who are in a vegetated state are able to experience, like it would seem like they wouldn't be able to experience reality in the same way, but yet you describe that oftentimes, like there's been studies to show that they're able to process abstract thoughts, even, and I might not be using the right words here, even though they're not materially able to function, there's still some, like doing math problems. You've been able to scientifically show this. So this is not, there's been studies to help us understand that. And maybe that's why it's significant even for us to enter into, when we have people who are in comas, why nurses speak positively to them and they recognize something's going on. There's more than just the physical brain injury.
Well, there are two kinds of phenomena that really speak to the continuation of the soul or the mind, even in the state of coma or a state of really compromised consciousness. One is studies that have been done on persistent vegetative state, which is basically a very deep form of coma. And the other is on something called paradoxical lucidity, which is an awareness that some people, for example, in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's can have. The persistent vegetative state studies were done initially by a guy named Adrian Owen, who was a neuroscientist who was at Cambridge in England back about 20 years ago. And it was believed at that time that people who were in persistent vegetative state, which are people who've had massive brain damage, the most severe kind of brain damage short of actually being brain dead. They weren't brain dead, but their brain was reduced to just a shriveled, almost nothing. And it would be from near drowning, from a cardiac arrest where your brain has suffered from lack of oxygen, from a bad car accident. And so Owen realized that, of course, a person who's had severe brain damage not only may have the inability to think, but they have the inability to purposely move, so they can't communicate. So he said, well, is it possible that they can think? It's just that they can't tell us because they're kind of locked in. So he took patients who were in persistent vegetative state, put them in an MRI machine, used a technique called functional MRI imaging, which shows activation patterns in what remained of their brains. And he asked some things like, imagine that you're walking across a room, imagine that you're playing tennis, all these questions to get them to think. And he saw that there were activation patterns in the remnant of their brain. And then he took people who were completely normal and put them in the MRI machine, and they had exactly the same activation patterns.
Wow.
So he said, it looks like this person is understanding. But then what he did was very clever to prove that the activation patterns were from understanding and not from maybe they're just from hearing the noise. Maybe they were hearing noise but not knowing what was being said. He put her back in the machine and he mixed the words. So instead of saying, imagine you're walking across the room, he would say, room, walking, imagine across your. So it didn't make any sense.
Sure.
And silent.
Interesting.
Her brain only responded.
Noise.
It wasn't just noise. The only time that her brain responded was when what was asked of her made sense. So, and then he found the normal people were the same way. So he said, she understood. She knew what I was talking about. So over time, other researchers have studied this. It's been found about 40% of people in persistent vegetative state can be communicated with using that technique. And there are people who answer questions. You can ask them, is your brother's name Joe? And a part of your brain will light up that corresponds to yes. And were you born in Ohio? And if you weren't, the part of your brain that corresponds to no will light up. So you can have conversations with people in the deepest level of colon. So, and there's a lot of research now going on about that. The other situation is paradoxical lucidity. And paradoxical lucidity is actually a very relatively common occurrence. My co-author on the book, Denise O'Leary's father, had episodes of this that she writes about. And it's where people who are in the advanced stages of dementia will have brief periods of time, maybe 20 or 30 minutes, where they're their old self again.
Yes. Yeah.
Walk into the room and Ma is Ma again. She's talking, she's happy, she's laughing, she's talking about things that happened years ago. And then they slip back into dementia. And it used to be called terminal lucidity because it did seem to have a tendency to happen just before death.
Right.
But not always.
Okay. Interesting.
And so where's that come from? And what all that implies is that there's an aspect of the soul that is not strictly in the brain, and that the soul works through the brain, but the brain isn't the whole story. And the observation that neuroscientists have made, that I've seen, that intellect and will don't come from the brain, implies that the soul is sort of the whole thing. And that goes back to Aristotle and Aristotle's view of the soul, which I think is a very profound view of what the soul is. Aristotle saw the soul as the sum of activities that make us alive. So the soul isn't anything that's all that mysterious. It's not this spooky, translucent thing that, kind of looks like you, but you can see through it. The soul is just everything about us that makes us alive. And if you want to have a more precise definition of what the soul is everything that's true about a human being before they die, minus everything that's true about them after they die. That is, if you take a dead body, subtract the dead body from the living body, everything you got left is the soul. So right now, the fact that my heart is beating is an aspect of my soul. The fact that my blood pressure is being controlled is an aspect of my soul. The fact that I'm seeing is an aspect. The fact that I'm thinking abstractly is an aspect. All of that's an aspect of soul. And Thomas Aquinas.
I was going to go there. That's great.
Well, he kind of followed on an Aristotelian view of the soul.
For sure.
And he pointed out, as St. Augustine and many other great theologians pointed out, that when you have powers of the soul, like reason, like forming concepts, like free will, that don't come from the brain or from the body specifically, those powers can't die. Because if you think about it, what does it mean when your body dies? Say that I die. Well, what really happens at death is that our bodies disintegrate. But the matter of our body doesn't disappear.
Right.
It just, it just goes into the ground.
Another state.
It goes into something else. And so what death means in terms of human life is disintegration of the body. And what the great theologians have asked is, and I think they've answered it rather nicely, is that, well, what does it mean for the soul to disintegrate? Because if you have aspects of the soul, like the immaterial capacity for reason or for free will, how does that disintegrate? You can't break reason up into little pieces and have the worms eat it. It doesn't make any sense.
It's a problem of materialism, like everything isn't just material.
Right. And one analogy that I use, that I think works very well, is the materialistic understanding of the human soul is like the materialistic understanding of the number 8. That is, that if you say, well, can the number 8 disappear or disintegrate or die? Well, in a sense it could. That is, if you write the number 8 on a piece of paper and you toss it into the fireplace, it burns up and the number 8 isn't there anymore. But that's just material 8. If you think of number 8 as being immaterial and metaphorically as being spiritual, well, how does that die? That is, how does the concept of number 8 die? You can't imagine a mathematics department announcing one morning that, well, we're sorry to say that the number 8 passed away last night, so we only have 7 to 9 now. That abstract things don't die. They can't die because they can't disintegrate. And the human soul is like the abstract number 8. It's not the kind. It's not so much that God won't let us die, although in that sense he won't. But it's that we naturally can't die with respect to our soul. Our soul is naturally immortal. Our bodies die. And as a Christian, I believe that we get reanimated. We get a spiritual body. But the soul not only doesn't die, it's not the kind of thing that can die.
Interesting. If this is the case, like from just an apologetics perspective of thinking of how we think about what is true, if it is true that all that we are is material reality, physical stuff, then why would we trust ourselves? Why would we trust our own thinking?
Exactly. But particularly if we were evolved by Darwinian mechanisms, then the only purpose for anything we do anyway is to procreate. So any thinking we do is just trying to make more babies. So it's kind of a ridiculous philosophy.
If people go back in the archives of this podcast, I had on Dr. Steve Blakemore, who's on our faculty. He's a philosopher and theologian, and he looked at Thomas Aquinas's view of the soul and compared it with Spinoza's. And one of his concerns is that even just using a language of dualism, body and soul, sometimes that can make it seem like they're two separate. But he kind of emphasizes this idea of hylomorphism that as a more accurate way to emphasize the continuity between our physical bodies and our non-material realities, that these things are together and will be together in the new creation.
Yeah, and then I think hylomorphism is, I think, the most profound metaphysical perspective that mankind has ever had. It's a beautiful, powerful way of understanding the world. And unfortunately, since Descartes, we've kind of abandoned it and caused all kinds of mischief. One way of looking at hylomorphism and at what some people call Thomistic dualism is that the relationship of the soul to the body is analogous to the relationship of a piece of wax that has a stamp in it. That the stamp has detail and information, and it's a work of art, etc. And the wax molds to manifest that detail, that work of art. The wax can melt and go away, but the stamp, the concept of the stamp, is still there.
Yes.
If you stamp a picture of someone's face on a piece of soft wax, the picture of someone's face is still a thing even after the wax melts away. There's still this concept of the person's face. So the soul and the body are intimately connected. They're not dualist in a sense. They're separate substances. But it's the nature of the soul that it can exist without the body. St. Thomas called that the subsistent soul. But of course, when our soul doesn't have a body in the intermediate state, that's not natural for us. It's not the way that we're meant to be. Our souls are meant to inhabit bodies,
and be embodied.
Right, In the Catholic perspective, I know there are some differences between the Catholic and the Protestant ways of looking at soul, body, and spirit and so on. But in the Catholic perspective, the human soul is a spirit. That is, that we are the only living thing whose soul is also a spirit. So we are spiritual creatures. Our spirits are our souls, and our souls are our spirits, and spirits don't die.
Yeah, in general, like, for instance, scripture that comes to mind is 1 Thessalonians 5:23 and 24. May your whole spirit, soul, and body be preserved blameless until the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. I've just tended to think of that as like not trying to be an anthropological statement or like a scientific statement. It's just like whatever it is that makes us up. That's what will be preserved blameless. Like, and it's a part of who we are. So
right. And I think the tendency, and I think we see this, and we can talk about this in near-death experiences, this concept comes across that when you're talking about spiritual matters, I think it's very important not to be too reductionist. That is, when the scripture talks about spirit, soul, and body, we're into spiritual matters, and it doesn't mean that, well, there's this lump right here that's your spirit, and there's a lump next to it that's your soul, and a lump next to it is your body. So although I think that as I understand them, many of the Protestant perspectives are entirely reasonable and could very, very, very well be true, I think the Catholic perspective that the spirit and soul are really the same thing is also perfectly reasonable, because we're in a spiritual realm, not in a material realm.
Well, when I say these type of things, this is where I get in trouble sometimes. Somebody will write me an email like, this is why you need to think about that. And that's pretty, I haven't, a historical theologian, I'm not necessarily like come into a place where I've had any problem adopting. I haven't even thought of that, Mike, as like a Catholic view, a Roman Catholic view.
Okay.
So, but I'm sure somebody will call me out on that. Now,
well, I've been called out by a few Protestant friends. They say, "Oh, no, Mike, no, it's a different thing," and they may very well be right. But I do think we have to be very careful about applying categories to spiritual concepts, because they're not the same as material concepts.
Right. Okay, I do want to get to near-death experience, but just kind of the order of your book, I'm going to go back to something that was so fascinating to me at the very beginning. Of course, I would never have thought of this, not being a scientist or not somebody who's done more than like freshman biology in college. So, but the idea of splitting the brain, like what that says to us, this is something that you see on not a regular basis, but there's studies to show that when the brain is split, that there are functions that happen that help us understand why and you talked about this a little bit, how like people had portions out, but the idea of splitting the brain, I didn't even know that was something that's possible until I read your book. So help me understand why that's important to this concept of the existence of the soul.
Well, split brain surgery is actually, it's been done thousands of times, and it was originated back in the 1940s and became much more widespread in the 50s and 60s. And it's not done as commonly today, but it is done, and I've done it. It is used to treat epilepsy, and there are some kinds of epilepsy that are completely resistant to medication, and there are people who have 30 seizures a day, and they're this nightmare of continuous seizures. And the hemispheres of the brain are connected by something called the corpus callosum, which is this huge bundle of fibers, roughly the size of the palm of your hand. And if you cut that fiber bundle, it inhibits the spread of the seizure in the brain. And people either stop having seizures, or the seizures are much more mild, and they can live much, much better lives. And so this operation has been done where the brain hemispheres are basically cut apart. So they're two separate hemispheres. There was a neuroscientist back in the 1960s named Roger Sperry who decided to study this, because he said, wow, this is like almost an experiment where you can find out what the individual hemispheres are doing, because now they're cut apart. You can study them separately. And there are ways of studying them separately by using the visual fields. You can tell one hemisphere one thing that the other hemisphere doesn't know. So you can do it. When we have connected hemispheres, they connect so well that you can't separate them experimentally, but you can separate them experimentally in people who've had split brain surgery. So Roger Sperry won the Nobel Prize for his work on this. But what he noticed, and that I've seen also, and it's quite remarkable, the most astonishing thing about split brain surgery is that it doesn't really affect people very much. It stops the seizures, but people generally don't know their brains have been split. They're perfectly normal people. You talk to them, you say, how do you feel? It's, I feel fine. And you say, do you feel like two people? He says, no, I don't feel like two people. I feel like me. It's the same thing. If I had split brain surgery, there's absolutely nothing different about me that would be present in this conversation. Perfectly normal. So I think that's amazing. I think sometimes in science, it's what you don't find that ought to take your breath away, not what you do find. And Sperry noticed this. This wasn't what he won the Nobel Prize for. Saying that nothing happens is not going to get you a Nobel Prize. But he did note it. He said, hey, yeah, it is kind of weird. Other people have followed up on that in much more detail. And one person that's followed up on it in a way that fascinates me is Alice Cronin, who is a neuroscientist at MIT, or was. She's not there anymore, but she was at MIT. And she did studies, I think some of the most detailed studies on split brain patients. And what she would do is, first of all, split brain stuff separates your ability to speak from your nonverbal hemisphere. So that, for example, the right hemisphere, which normally does not have speech, if you show an apple to the right hemisphere using the visual fields, the person will know that it's an apple, but they can't say the word.
Okay.
And there are all kinds of spooky things like that, and that's what Sperry won the Nobel Prize for. But Cronin did something rather different. She took pictures of things. For example, she took a picture of a violin and presented it to one hemisphere. To the other hemisphere, she presented three pictures: a picture of an artist's palette, a picture of a toilet plunger, and a picture of a stethoscope. And she said, in the one picture, conceptually, which of the three pictures conceptually matches the one picture?
Wow.
And it'd be the violin and the artist's palette, because they're both forms of art. And people with split brain surgery get those questions right perfectly. She had hundreds of sets of pictures, and people with split brain surgery instantly say, "Oh yeah, it's they can match the pictures conceptually." But what takes your breath away, and please understand what's going on, is that no part of the person's brain has seen both sets of pictures.
Wow, they're two different entities.
Right. One hemisphere sees the violin, the other hemisphere sees the artist's palette. How do they know they're conceptually connected?
Right.
Nothing in the brain sees both.
So it's in that case, it's the integrating function. I'm using my hands here of the soul.
Precisely.
That's doing that.
Well, right. And Yair Pinto, who's a neuroscientist who's done similar work, has famously described this as unified consciousness with split perception. And the problem is that the brain is not unified. So consciousness, to be unified, must have a source that's other than the brain. And of course, a spiritual soul can't be split with a knife. So I think right there, you're seeing right in front of you the soul.
Wow.
And so it's a beautiful, beautiful science.
I mean, you couldn't. I've heard some atheists like Sam Harris try to explain this as if, like, well, there's some matter on top of your brain that's somehow connected. But you're saying there's nothing physical, that a material that could actually make these connections.
There are two hypotheses, and when you read the neuroscience literature on this, there's a lot of agonizing over this, and there are three hypotheses generally that have been proposed. One is just hand waving, which is the usual materialist thing. Well, they'll say, we don't understand now. Hey, give us some time. We'll figure it out.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's, and when scientists say that, and I talk a lot about this, I say, hey, that's fine. Here's my cell phone number. When you actually get evidence, give me a call. But right now you don't have evidence.
Wow.
So, the second hypothesis is that there's some kind of externalized signaling. And Sperry found this in other situations where, like, for example, the person's feet. Sperry found a bizarre thing where he would show numbers to the nonverbal hemisphere. And the person sometimes could tell them what the number was, even though the hemisphere wasn't able to speak. But what he found was that, for example, if he showed the number 2, the person would say, in the nonverbal hemisphere, the person could say, oh, that's the number 2. And then he showed number 4, and they'd say, oh, that's the number 4. But he noticed that it would take them twice as long to say that's the number 4 as it took them to say the number 2, or 3 times as long to say the number 6. And what he found was that they were tapping their feet. That is, each leg is controlled by a different hemisphere, and they were unconsciously using the leg controlled by the nonverbal hemisphere to tap the opposite foot, and the opposite foot would count and tell them what the number was. And this was all not even conscious. So one of the arguments that people have made as to how this information gets across when the hemispheres are cut is that there's some kind of external signaling going on. But what researchers like Cronin, like Pinto, there's another Justine Surgeon did, is they videotape people so they can watch them as they're doing this.
Okay.
There's no sign of any signaling. Nothing's tapping anything. Besides, you can't tap a concept. How do you signal a concept of art from violin to a palette?
Yeah.
So that explanation doesn't work. The third explanation, which is more subtle but also doesn't work, is that there are roundabout ways in the brain. There are about 200 million axons in the corpus callosum that you cut with corpus callosotomy. There are about 1,500 axons that are in deeper levels of the brain that still connect the hemispheres.
Okay.
They still exist, and they can't be cut because they're in critical parts of the brain where you cause really, really serious damage. But the person's perception is still completely split. So there is a split. Those axons don't help you at all with that.
Okay.
The other thing is that there have been studies done of the rate of information transfer across those axons, and we're talking about I actually did the math, 0.000015% of the axons remain after the cutting.
Okay.
So they're almost all cut.
Yeah.
And these very few that remain, the information transfer across them has to be so slow because of the way action potentials work, that I think it's about 1 bit per second is what people estimate.
Okay.
And how you can't, how does 1 bit per second transmit the concept of art? It doesn't even make any sense.
Sure.
So the only thing that remains is so primitive and so small that it doesn't allow people to instantaneously make conceptual connections.
Yeah.
So, and the problem is in materialist neuroscience is that no one, as far as I know, in the scientific literature, has stated the obvious, that the fact that consciousness is unified means that you have an immaterial spiritual soul, which is the obvious interpretation. Everybody's afraid to say it because it's a materialist world.
Yeah. No. When you're in these conversations, what's your sense like with other neurosurgeons? And are others have come to the same realization?
Well, people in medicine and in engineering tend to be more open to things like this.
Okay.
I think as opposed to people in basic sciences, like an evolutionary biologist, a strict neuroscientist who just works in his lab. And I think a reason for that is that people in medicine and engineering face consequences. That is, if I get the way the mind works wrong, I put somebody in a coma, or I paralyze them, or I kill them. That is, I have to get it right every day. If an engineer doesn't get physics right,
yes,
the bridge collapses.
Yeah.
So we face the real world, and we can't just go on kind of crazy theories. Whereas if you're a basic scientist in a laboratory, for example, the vast majority of neuroscientists have never seen a living human brain.
Oh, wow. Interesting. I never thought of that.
You just work in a laboratory. You get your petri dishes.
Yeah.
You've never seen a living human brain before. So there's a disconnect that basic scientists have from the real world, I think, that allows them to have crazy theories.
Okay.
That if you have to face the real world. So I think there's quite a bit of sympathy within the neurosurgical profession from my perspective. Wilder Penfield, who was a great neurosurgeon, one of the pioneers, had the same viewpoint I have. And he started out as a materialist.
Yeah.
I've noticed there's a bit of an uptick on the internet over the past 6 months or so of even neuroscientists saying that there's strange stuff going on in the mind-brain relationship that I can't necessarily account for. Christoph Koch, who is really one of the leading, he's one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, and he and I did a podcast on Michael Shermer's show back a few months ago. And Koch's a great guy. He's brilliant. He's a very nice guy, very deep thinker, and he's starting to have some questions. Koch is starting to say, well, I was sticking to that materialist viewpoint, but there are odd things going on.
Yeah,
And
sure.
so a lot of neuroscientists who have integrity are beginning to say, well, maybe I need to open my mind a little bit to what's really going on in the mind-brain relationship.
Oh, I love it. This is so fascinating, just how God is working through all this. I think help people see through their own disciplines where he's left traces of himself. Now, I also was fascinated with your description of conjoined twins. Again, these some of the things in your book I've just never even thought about. So the fact that conjoined twins can sometimes see through each other's eyes,
Yeah.
feel each other's feelings on their skin, but yet there's a distinction between who they are, even though they share things.
Yeah, the most famous pair of conjoined twins, and there aren't many that share major parts of the brain, but there are some. Tatiana and Krista Hogan are two young ladies now who live in British Columbia, who have been studied in some detail. They were joined at the head, born joined at the head. They share what's called a thalamic bridge, which is a connection of brain tissue from deep inside the brain that goes to both of their brains. And they can see, partially at least, through each other's eyes. They can feel each other's skin. They have some control of each other's limbs. And they actually share some emotions also. But they're completely different people. That is, they have different opinions about things. They have fights. They don't always get along. There's no question that they're separate people, or in some sense that they have different souls. So you can share perception, you can share vision, you can share movement, you can share tactile sensation, and still be different souls, different people. What it implies is that the soul is not the same thing as the brain. The soul has a different immaterial spiritual existence.
Yeah, interesting. This such a helpful book, and I know that we're kind of it sounds for my listeners who are listening like, oh, this sounds too deep for me. And it certainly is too deep for me. It makes it grasp totally, but again, I just want to encourage you to take a look at Dr. Egnor's book. He's the co-author. I think is you together have made this a very readable format. I think that can really help folks. And of course, I've often pointed to, and a lot of folks who are pastors and theologians point to near-death experiences as a way to get people thinking empirically about a reality that exists outside of our material world. And I found that to be a way in to people, because you can point to the empirical nature of people's experiences. And you have some of these stories. So I'd love to just get your thoughts on near-death experiences. Of course, some people in my world would have been very familiar with Gary Habermas's work of documenting some of this, but I'm interested in how you think about these near-death experiences.
Sure. The near-death experiences, I think, clearly, in many cases, perhaps not all, but in many cases, represent actual experiences of survival of the soul after death. I think if it were not for the materialist bias that we have in our scientific community, that would just be acknowledged by everyone, because the evidence is really very clear. The paradigmatic near-death experience in modern times was that of Pam Reynolds,
Yes.
and Pam Reynolds was a woman in her mid-30s who had an aneurysm at the base of her brain, a ballooning of a blood vessel, and it was going to explode over probably the next year or two and kill her. And she needed to have a radical kind of operation called a standstill procedure, which was done by Robert Spetzler as a neurosurgeon in Phoenix in 1991. And the standstill procedure basically means that in order to fix the aneurysm, she had to actually be put in a state of death for about 30 minutes that allowed Spetzler to open the artery inside her brain and fix the aneurysm. And to open the artery, there couldn't be any blood flowing in it. So what Spetzler did was he put her under anesthesia, exposed the aneurysm, and then cooled her body down to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, put her on a heart-lung machine, stopped her heart, and that gave him about 30 minutes to open the aneurysm and fix it. And he raised the head of the operating table to drain the blood out of her brain, so the blood wasn't in the way of him fixing it. He fixed the aneurysm, and then he reversed the process and woke her up. And she made an excellent recovery. She did very well. So after the surgery, I mean, and by the way, for people who have aneurysms now, that we don't have to do that much anymore because there are much better techniques, endovascular techniques that are beautiful and almost miraculous. But this was this is about 30 years ago. We didn't have those techniques. So, and Spencer was a pioneer in this. He was a brilliant neurosurgeon. And so after the surgery, he was talking with her, and she said, I watched the whole operation. I saw everything. It was beautiful. He said, you couldn't have watched the operation.
Wow.
You were dead. We drained the blood out of your brain. Your eyes were taped shut. You had you had earplugs in making sounds so we could monitor your brain. You were brain dead. And she said, oh, no. So what she said was that when her heart stopped, she heard a natural D. She was a musician, so she knew tones. She said she heard this tone and then felt herself pop out of her body with a distinct pop. And then she saw her body. She saw the operating room, and she floated up to the ceiling. And she said it was beautiful. She could see everything. It was very clear. And then she said she hovered over Spetzer's shoulder, watched the operation. She then described to him what he did. She described to him the instruments he was using, what they looked like. She had no way of knowing. She described to him the conversations he had verbatim.
Yeah.
She described the music that was playing in the operating room. So she then went down a tunnel, the proverbial tunnel. She saw, I believe it was her grandparents who had passed away at the other end of the tunnel. And they told her she had to go back. She couldn't stay because she had children to raise. So she goes back down the tunnel, goes back into her body. She says it felt like diving into ice water. It was a very uncomfortable feeling because her body temperature was 60 degrees. So yeah, it was actually. So when I discuss this with materialists, with the materialist scientists who doubt the reality of near-death experiences, I give them what I call the Pam Reynolds challenge. I say that, you can kind of make up little stories about how maybe it's like a seizure the patient's having, or there's brain chemicals that do this, or some crazy theory. But you have to explain the whole experience. And Pam Reynolds' experience is a paradigm of that. And there are 4 things that people with near-death experiences often have that I think cannot be explained by any kind of materialistic thing. The first thing is that near-death experiences generally are very clear. Very, 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 there's an enhancement of our awareness, which is not what happens when you cut off oxygen to the brain. It's not what happens during a seizure. Those things don't make you better. But near-death experiences, the perceptions and the thoughts are much more profound, much deeper, and much more beautiful. The second thing is that people often have out-of-body experiences, like Pam Reynolds, where they see things that could not be accounted for otherwise. There have been studies done on people who've had near-death experiences during cardiac arrests that show that people with near-death experiences almost always get every detail of the cardiac arrest correct, whereas people who had a cardiac arrest but didn't have a near-death experience get about 80% of the time get major things wrong. So that there is a real perception going on. Out-of-body experiences can be checked and can be confirmed. And a lot of people have confirmable out-of-body experiences when they are clinically dead. The third phenomenon that I think is absolutely fascinating and that people often don't quite appreciate is that when you go down the tunnel and you get to the other side of the tunnel, you often will meet people. There's no recording that I know of in the scientific literature, and there have been thousands of near-death experiences reported, where people met a living person at the other end.
Interesting. Yes.
They're always dead people, even if they didn't know they were dead. Yes. There are situations, there are several situations where people have been in car accidents where there were multiple people in the car taken to different hospitals. And a person will have a near-death experience and see one of the people in the car, but not the other people. But the one they see is always one who died.
Wow.
Not one who lived. And the fourth characteristic of near-death experiences is that they are usually transformative. That is, that people commonly lose their fear of death. They're really a different person after it happens, implying that something genuinely transformative, genuinely spiritual happened. So near-death experiences are very well documented scientifically. There's still a lot that we need to know about them. I must say they are not theologically comfortable. That is that, as I'm sure you agree, what people see on the other side as reported in near-death experiences does not always align with Christian teaching. It's not necessarily completely inconsistent,
Right,
but
right,
it's not like everybody steps over and there's Christ waiting with his arms open.
right, right.
And but the scientific reality of survival of the soul after death in near-death experiences, to me, seems undeniable. Undeniable.
Yeah, it's hard to map out what that would be, like what people's experiences are based upon the way they record them, and to say, okay, that's what the intermediate state will be like. I rest take a lot of comfort in the fact that it shows there is one,
Right.
and like
Right.
I can deal with that on the other side.
Well, a couple of things are interesting. One is that you are dead in one very real sense, but you're not irreversibly dead. And people are very often told once they get to the other side of the tunnel that you can't go any further, because if you go further, it can't be undone. So you're not on the other side yet. It's like you're outside the city looking in. You're not you're not in the city. So what's on the other side has never been glimpsed by a person who's come back to life, except our Lord. But so it's still just a fragmentary experience. The other thing that I think is very important, and has been commented on, particularly by Carol Zaleski, who's a literary scholar who wrote a wonderful book called Otherworld Journeys, which fascinates me. And it's basically a history of near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences. And what Zaleski points out is that these experiences tend to be ineffable. There are things that you can't find words for, because in our mortal life, we don't have direct contact with spiritual existence.
Right.
So how do we describe it? How do you describe something that's spiritual? So what we tend to do is we attach mortal things, mortal concepts, to immortal spiritual things, because we don't have immortal spiritual words for them.
Yes.
And so we interpret them through our lens. And she said cultures tend to interpret near-death experiences through their own way of thinking, not because those experiences actually are what they say they are, but because those are the only words they have for them.
Yeah.
And many people will say that. They'll say, I'm going to tell you what happened. But what I'm telling you is not what happened. It's just, it's the only word. It's the only words I have.
I remember watching the 1990s movie with Matthew McConaughey and Jodie Foster called Contact. And there's this interesting place like where she goes off and aliens, some other entity outside the world calls her, and she sees, and there's so many minutes recorded. But every now and then I remember this line that she says, she was a scientist. They sent the wrong person. They sent a scientist. They should have sent a poet. They should have sent a poet, because this ineffable quality that there's whatever it is. And I think I was thinking about the reality of the intermediate state, this kind of layover station before Jesus' return and the resurrection of all bodies and a new heavens and new earth. Like, we have a lot in scripture poetically and eschatological poetry that helps us think about the eternal state. But and while I affirm, and there are certain like theologians, evangelical theologians, that don't affirm an intermediate state, I do, and I'm very because I think scripture does, but I also think scripture doesn't say a lot. Scripture just says, it depends on the translation, to be absent from the body is present with the Lord, or at home with the Lord. Or you could also say, Paul says he would rather be with the Lord. It's better. But we don't know much more. I mean, we can trust that our loved ones are in this, quote, better place. But I'm okay with not knowing too much of the intermediate state. But I am excited, ultimately, that this kind of points to the truth of divine revelation, that there will be an eternal state.
Absolutely. And one analogy that helps me to grasp this is if when I was a fetus inside my mother's womb,
amen.
And if you had asked me if you can ask a fetus anything, what's it going to be like on the other side? What words would I have had? I didn't have words.
Right.
I had never seen light.
Yeah.
I'd never seen any temperature except 98.6. I have no concept. I mean, it's not even imaginable that if that a fetus would describe the delivery room. And when he sees the delivery room,
Yeah.
all he can do is cry. Yeah,
Amen.
he's got no words for it. He couldn't possibly describe it. So we're talking about a world that is richer and so radically different.
Yes.
On the issue of the movie Contact,
Yeah. Yeah.
just to kind of highlight how completely clueless atheists and materialists really are, is Carl Sagan, who was a very naive man in many ways. He was fascinating, but he was almost a caricature of a naive atheist. Loved the book and loved the movie. Thought it was wonderful. And he talked often about it. Wouldn't it be fascinating to get this alien intelligence that sends us a blueprint of something? And you just want to take Carl by his shoulders and say, haven't you ever looked at DNA? If you want a blueprint from another intelligence but us, look at the genetic code.
Mm.
It's been sent to you already. You're just ignoring it.
Wow.
That the blueprints are out there. You don't have to look for aliens. You don't have to look for Jodie Foster is not going to help you learn about blueprints. Just open up a book on molecular genetics. You got the blueprints right in front of you. And so why aren't you acknowledging the existence of the designer of the genetic code?
Wow.
And but a clueless atheist is almost redundant.
Yeah.
So, all right.
I want to piece this together with a podcast that came out probably by the time this one comes out about a month or so later. I had on a historical theologian who is talking about 18th century Methodists and particularly John Wesley's view of death. And what she noted is that the Arminian magazine, which was the Methodist magazine that came out weekly, at least, and it had regular descriptions of deathbed experiences. And the paradoxical lucidity that you talk about was something that was documented almost on a weekly basis.
Yes.
With them here. And so, I mean, I've even had these and so the idea was like Methodists, because of this understanding, had a clarity at the end of their life. Now, I'm sure it's true with other Christians too. I'm not just trying to be tribalistic with that, but that was this definite sense that there was a clear perception at the end of one's life. And so people would talk about those who have been probably something similar to dementia, being able to recall multiple verses of a hymn and be able to say that at the end of their life. And I see like these pieces coming together with not just near-death experiences, but with this lucidity that you described. And I think this is like kind of pointing us to the existence of the soul and even the purpose of our creation.
Well, the hypothesizing the existence of the soul, particularly in the Thomistic perspective of hylomorphic dualism, has enormous explanatory power. Enormous. It explains a whole range of human experience, a whole range of neuroscience. It accords a hylomorphic understanding of the human soul, accords beautifully even with basic physics. I mean, it's a very powerful idea, and again, regrettably, was set aside in the early modern period by Descartes and Bacon and other philosophers. And I think that was an enormous mistake. And a lot of the dilemmas we have today in understanding the mind-brain relationship, et cetera, are dilemmas that we've created ourselves by abandoning a much more profound metaphysical perspective, which is the metaphysical perspective of the great Christian theologians. I mean, Augustine and Aquinas understood things much, much more deeply than most moderns do.
Yeah. I'm going to send you a link to our philosopher's book on this, and he finds a lot of help from this with Spinoza too, which is really interesting. I think, and if folks just put these two podcasts together, because it kind of takes the philosopher's take along with the neurosurgeon's take. This has been such a great conversation. Mike, thank you for your time. And I always ask the question if there's more to the story. Now, I have that for a theological reason, because in our school emphasizes the doctrine of sanctification, that we need to sense that God wants to transform us to be more like him and more in deeper union with him. So I have that, but also I like to use it more to story. as your story. Is there, you talk a lot about your experiences and your own testimony here, but is there more to the story of Dr. Egnor?
So, I contain multitudes,
Okay.
as they, well, besides my Christian faith and my love of the Lord and my desire to tell people the truth about neuroscience and the truth about the human soul, I'm also very fascinated by blood flow in the brain, and that's my main area of scientific research.
Interesting.
And so, one of my goals in life is to help treat certain diseases that are currently difficult to treat by a deeper understanding of how the blood flow and the spinal fluid flow work. So if there's more to me, it's that I spend half, besides my family and so on, I spend half my time thinking about the soul and the other half thinking about how blood goes through the brain.
Interesting. Is there anything we should be doing to take care of our brains? Anything?
Well, taking care of our bodies is a good place to start.
Yeah.
I mean, don't smoke, don't drive your car going 100 miles an hour. Try to be healthy. And honestly, I think that keeping intellectually active is extremely helpful. I really think that the mind and the soul are analogous in some ways to a muscle, and they wither if you don't use them.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you so much for your time today. And friends, just want to encourage you to find this book, The Immortal Mind, a Neurosurgeon's Case for the Existence of the Soul. I think you'll find it to be a blessing and encouraging to you of the things that, God's divine inerrant revelation has already revealed. But we're thankful for the additional clarity that comes from this book. Thank you so much for your time, Mike. It means a lot to me.
Thank you, Andy. It's been wonderful to talk to you.